You miserable son of a bitch. I gave you my heart, I gave you my soul, I gave you my body, and you just threw me aside like I was some piece of garbage.
Yeah, my bad.
A piano fell from the sky, crushed a man on a doorstep, and ended one of television's most profitable sitcoms with a punchline aimed directly at the actor who used to play the lead. That single image, absurd and almost cartoonish, was the final word in a feud that had already cost hundreds of jobs, tens of millions of dollars, and a friendship that once looked unbreakable. To understand why that piano fell, and why it landed exactly where it did, you have to go back to a bar in Los Angeles, a conversation between two writers, and a show nobody was sure would even survive its first season. 2.5 Men began as an idea born from real life. Chuck Lorre, already a respected producer, sat down with a friend who was raising a son while sharing a home with his unmarried brother. That domestic arrangement, equal parts comedy and chaos, became the seed of a series. The original pitch looked nothing like what audiences eventually watched. It centered on a single father, his gay brother, and a straight son, a setup CBS worried might alienate its broader audience. The network pushed for something simpler, and the writers obliged, reshaping the concept into a carefree jingle writer, his uptight chiropractor brother, and the boycott between them. It was a compromise, but it worked, and from that compromise came a premise that would dominate network television for over a decade. Getting the show made was its own battle. Just weeks before filming was scheduled to begin, CBS nearly pulled the plug entirely, spooked by a production budget that dwarfed comparable sitcoms of the era. Lorre personally cut his own salary and renegotiated contracts to keep the project alive, a sacrifice that rarely gets mentioned in retrospectives focused on the show's later collapse. The set itself, that now iconic beach house, was modeled after Lorre's own home, recreated on a soundstage down to small design details. Even the theme song was composed by Lorre himself in under an hour, written almost as an afterthought just before filming began. The title took until the final weeks to settle on, after names like My Brother's Keeper and Three's a Crowd were tossed around and discarded as producers searched for something simpler, something that would sit comfortably on a marquee. Casting proved just as unpredictable. The role that made Charlie Sheen a household name almost went to John Stamos, who turned it down without much hesitation. Sheen himself resisted at first, unwilling to commit to episodic television after years of feature film work, until Lorre spent nearly half a day at his house convincing him otherwise. John Cryer, who would go on to anchor the show for its entire run, originally read for the part of Charlie, not Alan, and was considered too likable and too gentle for the role he wanted. The nephew, Jake, went to a young Angus T. Jones, the last child to audition, chosen despite a last-minute growth spurt that briefly worried producers before they simply wrote jokes about it into the scripts. Even the early chemistry between the leads was rocky. During the first week of filming, Sheen and Cryer clashed over how a line should be delivered, and Sheen reportedly walked off set for several hours. Oddly, that blow-up seemed to clear the air between them, and the tension that followed transformed into one of the show's most enduring creative partnerships. When the show premiered in the fall of 2003, critics dismissed it as formulaic and crude. Audiences disagreed almost immediately, and within a handful of episodes, ratings climbed high enough to surprise even the network that had greenlit it. The show found an especially strong following among women, prompting CBS to retool its marketing strategy mid-run to capture a demographic nobody expected a bachelor comedy to attract. International syndication followed quickly, and by the following year the series was airing in dozens of countries, breaking viewership records in markets that rarely embraced American sitcoms so enthusiastically. By its third season, it had become the network's top-rated comedy, commanding some of the most expensive advertising slots on television and drawing marathon viewership numbers whenever CBS aired reruns in primetime. At the center of all of it was Charlie Sheen, playing a version of a carefree, self-destructive bachelor that audiences found impossible to look away from. Part of the show's magnetism came from how closely Sheen's public persona mirrored the character he played on screen. Viewers weren't just watching a sitcom, they were watching a man perform a fictionalized version of rumors they'd already heard about his personal life, and that blur between performance and reality made the show feel dangerous in a way network comedy rarely did. By the end of the decade, Sheen had become the highest-paid actor in television history, a distinction that would soon collide head-on with his personal unraveling. When his contract came up for renewal, Sheen was already earning hundreds of thousands of dollars per episode, an enormous figure by any standard. He wanted more, demanding a deal that would push him past $2 million an episode. Negotiations dragged on for weeks, reportedly continuing even during a basketball game, until the studio relented just before its fall lineup announcements were due. It became the largest per-episode salary in television history, a fact made even stranger by the timing. Only months earlier, Sheen had been arrested following a domestic violence incident involving his then-wife. The producers paid regardless, understanding that without him, the show's commercial engine would stall. What followed was a slow-motion collapse that played out partly behind the scenes and partly in full public view. On set, Sheen's behavior grew increasingly erratic. There were days he could barely stand without support, forgetting lines that writers had to hastily redistribute to other characters. His relationship with Lorre deteriorated into open hostility, with Sheen reportedly tearing up scripts in front of the crew and publicly mocking the writing. None of this emerged from nowhere. Sheen's struggles with substance abuse stretched back over a decade, beginning with a cocaine overdose in the late 90s that sent him to rehab for the first time. By the end of 2009, he was arrested again, this time for an altercation with his wife on Christmas Day. Rehab followed once more, and by the following autumn, a drunken, destructive night in a New York hotel room added another chapter to a pattern that seemed to be accelerating rather than slowing. By January of 2011, the studio made the decision to halt production entirely, hoping to give Sheen space to recover. Instead, he spiraled further, indulging in a widely reported multi-day binge that ended with a hospital visit, followed by public claims that he had cured himself through sheer will. What came next turned Sheen from a troubled actor into a full-blown media spectacle. In a radio interview, he unloaded on Lorre with a string of insults, calling him names that shocked even seasoned entertainment reporters and using language many considered deeply offensive. He described himself in increasingly bizarre terms, claiming extraordinary physical and mental abilities, and challenging Lorre to a physical confrontation. Interview after interview followed, each one stranger than the last, filled with phrases that quickly became cultural shorthand for celebrity meltdown. Within days, he had joined social media and broken records for follower growth, proof that audiences couldn't look away even as the substance of what he said grew increasingly incoherent. The studio's patience ran out on March 7, 2011. Sheen was fired, a decision that shocked the industry given his status as the highest-paid actor on television at the time. The termination letter accused him of erratic and dangerous conduct, disparagement of the show's creator, and behavior that potentially crossed legal lines. The fallout was immediate and severe. Roughly 200 crew members lost work as remaining episodes were scrapped, and the show absorbed millions in losses. Sheen responded within days by suing for breach of contract, seeking an enormous settlement and arguing he had been unfairly blamed for problems that weren't his alone. The legal fight eventually moved to arbitration, and by autumn a confidential settlement was reached, one that reportedly included a substantial upfront payment along with a continued share of the show's future earnings. With its lead gone, the show needed a replacement fast. Hugh Grant came close to accepting the role before abruptly withdrawing over creative disagreements, throwing the production into a scramble just days before a major presentation to advertisers. Ashton Kutcher stepped in on short notice, signing for a season's worth of episodes at a fraction of Sheen's former salary, but still an enormous sum by industry standards. His debut episode opened with Charlie Harper's funeral, killed off in an accident overseas, a dark joke that doubled as closure for Sheen's departure. The premiere drew nearly double the show's usual audience, proof that curiosity alone could carry a franchise even without its original star. Kutcher's character, a wealthy but emotionally fragile tech figure recovering from divorce, reshaped the show's dynamic. Alan, once the hapless one, became something closer to a mentor, and new storylines followed Walden's awkward attempts at love and reinvention. Jake's role shrank steadily as the story's center of gravity shifted, and by the show's final seasons, Angus T. Jones was barely present at all. That absence had its own complicated backstory. As Jones grew older, he became increasingly uncomfortable with the show's content, eventually appearing in a video for a religious organization where he urged viewers to stop watching, calling the material he had spent years performing deeply at odds with his faith. The backlash was immediate, and though he apologized for how his comments landed, he never retracted the substance of what he said. His relationships with castmates grew strained, and by 2013 he was no longer a regular cast member, stepping away entirely to pursue education and a quieter life, though he did return briefly for a small role in the series finale. That finale arrived in February 2015, engineered for maximum secrecy and speculation. Teasers hinted that Charlie might somehow return, and fans spent weeks debating whether Sheen himself would appear. He never did, at least not literally. Instead, the show delivered its most talked-about scene in over a decade of episodes. A man resembling Charlie approached the beach house, only to be crushed instantly by a falling piano. Moments later, the camera revealed Lorre himself on screen, delivering Sheen's old catchphrase before a second piano dropped on him too, a closing joke that read as equal parts tribute and retaliation. Reactions split sharply between those who found it a fitting, darkly funny farewell, and those who saw it as needlessly cruel toward a man already struggling. In the years since, the show's cast scattered into wildly different lives. Sheen faced further public difficulty, including a 2015 health disclosure, before slowly working his way back into television with smaller roles. Cryer built a respected, steady career and collected industry recognition along the way. Kutcher expanded into producing and technology investment. Jones stepped almost entirely away from the spotlight, choosing education and quiet reinvention over fame. What remains, more than a decade later, isn't just the memory of a hit sitcom, but a cautionary story about what unchecked success, ego, and addiction can do to even the most talented people, and how one falling piano became the perfect symbol for an ending nobody could have scripted any other way.